Some nights the sky holds a kind of stillness that feels almost deliberate. The light fades slowly, the air settles, and for a moment everything seems to be exactly where it belongs. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you're welcome to stay. Now, let's drift. There is something quietly strange about an ordinary evening. Not strange in a way that demands attention. Strange in the way a familiar room can feel late at night when the shadows fall just slightly differently than usual. Nothing has changed, and yet for a breath, everything feels softer, slower, as if the day itself is exhaling. Tonight, we are going to follow that feeling. Not toward anything dramatic, just toward a quiet question that scientists have been sitting with for a long time. What does an ordinary day actually feel like from the inside without knowing what kind of day it is? Right now, as you lie here, the ground beneath you is moving. Not shifting in any way you would notice, but the earth itself is turning, carrying you along at a speed of roughly 1,000 miles an hour, somewhere around the equator, slightly less the farther you are from it. Researchers have found that this motion is so smooth, so constant, that the human body has no way to register it at all. There is no sensation of speed, no wind, no pull, no sense of motion whatsoever. It is one of those facts that once you sit with it feels almost impossible. A spinning world, and yet a glass of water on a table does not ripple. A candle flame does not flicker sideways. Everything simply rests as if the movement and the stillness are somehow the same thing. Scientists suggest this has to do with something called inertia. Everything around you, the air, the furniture, your own body is moving at the same steady speed as the planet itself. So relative to you, nothing seems to move at all. It is a little like being inside a smoothly gliding train late at night, where the only way you would know you were moving is by looking outside. Except here there is no window large enough to see the whole picture. We're simply inside it. There is something comforting in that in a quiet way. A reminder that enormous things can happen. Things on a scale almost too large to picture and still feel from the inside like nothing at all. Like calm. Like an evening that feels just like any other evening. It seems that this is part of what makes a day feel ordinary in the first place. Not the absence of motion or change, but the steadiness of it. The body tends to interpret consistency as safety. When the rhythm of a day matches the rhythm of the day before something in the nervous system settles. The shoulders drop slightly. The breathing slows. Even before the mind notices anything, the body has already started to relax. Psychologists often note that this sense of normal is one of the most powerful feelings a person can have, even though it rarely gets much attention. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like an event. It simply feels like nothing in particular. And yet that feeling of nothing in particular may be one of the most important signals the brain receives all day. A quiet message that says everything is fine. You can rest now. Of course, there is something gently strange about that too. Because if you think about it for a moment, almost every day in history has felt to the people living it like an ordinary day. The evenings before great discoveries, the evenings before long journeys, the evenings before the kinds of changes that looking back seem enormous. To the people living through them in that moment, the sky probably just looked like the sky. The air probably just felt like the air. Researchers who study memory have found that most ordinary moments are not stored very deeply at all. The brain tends to let them pass by almost untouched, because there is nothing urgent about them, nothing that needs to be remembered. It is only the unusual moments, the surprising ones, the emotional ones that tend to leave a deeper trace. Which means that somewhere in the long unfolding of time there have been evenings exactly like this one. Quiet evenings. Settled evenings. Evenings that felt completely unremarkable to the people experiencing them and were never written down, never remembered, simply lived. and then gently released the way a breath is released without anyone noticing it leave. There is something almost tender about that thought. All those ordinary nights drifting away unnoticed, one after another, each one feeling in its own small way like this one feels right now. Some scientists believe that this sense of ordinariness is not a flaw in human perception. It may actually be a kind of protection, a way of allowing the mind to rest even while the world continues to turn beneath it, continues to shift in ways too slow and too vast to notice. The mind quietly registers stability, even when the bigger picture is always gently in motion. And so tonight, as the light continues to fade and the air continues to settle, there's nothing you need to figure out, no conclusion to reach, just the quiet, steady feeling of an evening that feels like every other evening, which is in its own way exactly the point. Because to understand what makes a day feel ordinary, it helps to look a little closer at the planet itself. At the layers it has been quietly building for longer than almost anything else we know, layers that remember things the mind does not. And in one of those layers resting beneath the surface there is something that has been waiting very patiently for a very long time. That layer is thin, thinner than most people imagine, a narrow band of dark clay found in rock formations all over the world, in places as different from each other as desert cliffs and ocean floors. Geologists sometimes call it the boundary layer, and it marks a moment in time so distinct that it can be found almost everywhere on the planet in roughly the same form. What makes it strange is not how it looks. It is just a thin streak of darker stone easy to miss if you are not looking for it. What makes it strange is what it is made of. Researchers have found that this layer contains unusually high levels of a rare element called iridium, an element that is far more common in asteroids and comets than it is in the rocks of Earth's surface. It seems that the layer formed all at once, geologically speaking, after a massive impact scattered that material across the globe. A single event separating one era from another so cleanly that scientists can run a finger along certain cliff sides and feel quite literally the moment where one world ended and another began. There is something almost dreamlike about that, a boundary you can touch, a line pressed into stone marking the last ordinary day of an entire age, and yet on that day nothing would have looked like an ending. The sky would have looked like sky, the light would have moved the way it always moved. Whatever lived through that morning, if anything did, would have had no reason to feel that the day was different from any other. The brain tends to interpret the world through pattern, through repetition. If yesterday was safe, today is assumed to be safe as well. This is not a flaw. It is in many ways an efficient way for a mind to operate. Constantly questioning whether the world might end today would make it very difficult to do anything else. So instead, the mind quietly registers continuity again and again until continuity itself becomes invisible, just the background hum of being alive. What is interesting is that this same quiet trust in continuity exists in us right now, in this very moment. Lying here in the dark, the body is not bracing for anything. It assumes gently and without thought that this night will be much like other nights, that tomorrow's light will rise the way it has risen so many times before. There is a kind of grace in that assumption, a softness, the mind allowing itself to simply exist without needing proof that existence will continue. Geologists describe these dark thin layers as a kind of memory. Not memory in the way we usually think of it, made of images or feelings, but memory written into stone itself. Pressure, heat and time slowly transforming a single moment into something that can last for millions of years, longer than almost anything else that moment could have left behind. It is strange to think that the ground beneath any quiet evening might be holding traces like this. Not dramatic ones, just thin lines hidden under layers of soil and rock, each one marking some shift the surface of the world experienced long ago. Most of these layers have never been noticed. They sit quietly undisturbed the way most ordinary days sit quietly in the mind, neither remembered nor forgotten, simply present. What we understand so far suggests that the Earth has gone through several of these dramatic shifts, spaced very far apart, each one separated by long, slow stretches where very little of note seems to happen at all. From the perspective of the rocks themselves, those slow stretches are not empty. They are filled with the quiet accumulation of sediment, of dust, of the soft remains of tiny organisms drifting down through ancient seas, layer upon layer, each one so thin it would take thousands of years to build even a few inches. There is something soothing about that scale of time. A reminder that most of what happens, even on a planetary level, happens slowly, quietly, without anyone watching. The Earth does not rush toward its changes. It allows them to settle the way dust settles in a still room, the way thoughts settle in a quiet mind at the end of a long day. Evidence suggests that the organisms living just before one of these major shifts had no biological mechanism for anticipating what was coming. There was no internal alarm, no instinct that could have prepared them. Their bodies were built for the world as it had always been, the world of yesterday, the world of the day before that. In a way, their entire existence was built around the assumption of continuity, the same quiet assumption that allows any creature on any evening to simply rest. Some scientists believe that this is not a tragedy so much as a kind of universal truth, that every living thing at every point in time exists inside its own version of an ordinary day. There is no way to live constantly aware of every possible ending. Life by its nature leans toward the present moment, toward the next breath, the next heartbeat, the next quiet stretch of time that feels for now simply like now. And there is something gentle in that. A kind of permission almost to exist fully inside this evening without needing to know what any other evening might bring. The light fading outside the window does not know what tomorrow looks like either. It simply fades the way it always has, the way light has faded at the end of countless days, each one feeling to whoever was there to notice it like just another evening. Psychologists often note that this present-focused way of experiencing time is in some ways deeply protective. The mind is not built to hold the full weight of deep time of millions of years compressed into thin lines of stone. It is built to hold this breath, this moment, this soft, quiet feeling of being here now with nothing urgent required. Perhaps that is part of why an ordinary evening can feel in its own quiet way complete. Not because nothing important is happening. Things are always happening on scales too slow or too small to notice, but because for this moment none of that needs to be felt. The body can simply rest in the present the way it always has, the way it always will, for as long as there is a present to rest in. And if the mind were to drift back even further than those ancient layers in the rock, even further than the deep, slow accumulation of sediment and time, it would find itself somewhere even quieter. A place before layers, before boundaries. A place where time itself moved so slowly that even the rocks had not yet learned to remember anything at all. It is there in that deep and unhurried stillness that we will continue. There is a particular kind of family photograph that almost every household seems to have somewhere tucked into a drawer or a shoebox. The kind where someone points to a face you don't recognize and says that's your great-great-grandmother, and you stare at her for a long moment trying to find some piece of yourself in a stranger's eyes. Tonight I want you to hold on to that feeling, because what we're about to talk about is the closest thing science has ever come to handing humanity its own version of that photograph. For most of the 20th century, the story most people learned about human evolution was almost embarrassingly tidy. There were the Neanderthals, this other kind of human who lived in Europe and parts of Asia. And then there was us modern Homo sapiens who arrived later and, according to the version many of us grew up with, simply replaced them. Out with the old, in with the new. Clean, simple, and as it turns out, almost completely wrong. The first hint that something deeper was going on came in 2010, the same year researchers were piecing together the Denisovan story from that finger bone in Siberia. A team led by the same geneticist Svante Paabo finished sequencing the first complete Neanderthal genome using DNA extracted from bones found in Croatia. And when they compared that genome to the DNA of people living today outside of Africa, they found something that frankly upended a century of assumptions. Roughly 1 to 2% of the DNA in most non-African populations today comes directly from Neanderthals. Now on its own, that might sound like a tidy little factoid, the kind of thing you'd read on the back of a cereal box. But sit with it for a second. That number means that somewhere, sometime around 50 to 60,000 years ago, in the cold river valleys of what is now the Middle East or Europe, modern humans and Neanderthals were not just crossing paths, they were starting families together. And here's a question worth asking yourself. How do you think those two groups actually saw each other? We tend to picture Neanderthals as almost a different species, entirely lumbering and primitive, something out of an old black and white documentary. But genetically, the line between us and them was thin enough to cross repeatedly in multiple places over thousands of years. Thin enough that today, if you have European or Asian ancestry, there's good chance you're carrying a small inheritance from someone who by any modern definition would not be considered the same species as you. What's strange, and I think genuinely beautiful in a quiet way, is what those inherited genes actually do. They're not just leftover noise in our DNA. Some of them are working right now inside the bodies of people listening to this. Certain Neanderthal gene variants are linked to how our immune systems respond to viruses, an inheritance that may have helped early modern humans survive diseases they encountered for the first time as they moved into new environments. Other variants influence skin tone, hair texture, even how some people metabolize certain medications. There's even research suggesting that a Neanderthal inherited gene variant affects how some people experience pain, making them slightly more sensitive to it than others. So somewhere deep in your own biology, there might be a tiny echo of a relationship that happened tens of thousands of years ago between two people who technically belong to different branches of the human family tree. Doesn't that just completely change how you think about the phrase ancient history? It's not really that ancient. It's sitting in your cells right now. Now here's where things get even more tangled, because the story doesn't stop with just Neanderthals and us. Remember the Denisovans we talked about earlier, that mysterious cousin known almost entirely through scattered fragments of bone and the genetic fingerprints they left behind? Well, when scientists started comparing Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, and modern human DNA all together, they found something almost soap opera-worthy hidden in the genetic record. Neanderthals and Denisovans interbred too, with each other. In 2018, researchers analysed a bone fragment found in that same Denisova cave and discovered it belonged to a girl whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan. Not a distant ancestor from each group, mind you, but a direct first-generation child of two different kinds of ancient humans. Scientists nicknamed her Denny. And when I first read about this, I genuinely had to stop and reread the sentence, because it sounds almost too neat to be real. A single bone belonging to a single child who happened to be the direct offspring of two entirely different lineages of ancient humans, found in the one cave that started this whole modern investigation in the first place. What are the odds of that? Out of all the bone fragments that could have survived out of all the caves on the planet, this particular one turns up in this particular place. Sometimes I think the universe has a strange sense of timing, but Denny's existence tells us something important. Something that I think reshapes the entire picture we should be holding in our minds tonight. These weren't separate, isolated populations living in their own little bubbles. occasionally bumping into each other by accident. Neanderthals and Denisovans appear to have overlapped in range, lived close enough to encounter one another regularly, and interbred often enough that finding a direct hybrid child wasn't some statistical miracle. It happened. More than once, probably across thousands of years. And then modern humans arrived into this picture too, moving out of Africa in waves, encountering both Neanderthals and Denisovans at different points along the way in different regions at different times. Each encounter left its own genetic signature like layers of paint on an old wall, each one telling you something about who was here and when, and who they met while they were passing through. This is why when geneticists talk about human ancestry today, they don't really talk about a tree anymore, not in the way most of us were taught to imagine it. A tree has a trunk, branches splitting off cleanly, each one growing in its own direction, never touching again. What actually happened looks more like a river delta, branches splitting apart and then merging back together, separating again, crossing paths in places nobody expected, carrying sediment from one channel into another. Here's something else worth sitting with for a moment. We've been talking about Neanderthals and Denisovans as though they're the only two cousins in this family photograph. But genetic studies have found hints, faint signals really, of what some researchers describe as a possible third, even more mysterious lineage contributing to the DNA of certain populations in Africa. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else entirely, a ghost population that interbred with early modern humans on the African continent itself, leaving behind traces that scientists are still trying to fully untangle. Scholars still debate how many of these ancient lineages actually existed, and how widespread their contributions really were. Some of this research is genuinely at the frontier of what current technology allows us to detect. But even the existence of the debate tells you something remarkable. We are still right now in this decade discovering relatives we never knew we had. I find something quietly comforting in all of this, if I'm honest. We live in a world that often feels obsessed with drawing lines between people, this group and that group, us and them. And yet here is the actual scientifically documented history of our species, and it is one long, messy, beautiful story of crossing those exact same lines over and over again for hundreds of thousands of years. Every line we think divides us has at some point in the deep past been crossed by someone, and that crossing became part of who we are now. But here's where the story takes a turn that I think is going to surprise you maybe more than anything we've covered so far. Because everything we've talked about tonight, the finger bone in Siberia, the jaw on the Tibetan plateau, even little Denny and her two different parents, all of that happened on the mainland across vast stretches of Europe and Asia. What happens, though, when one of these ancient lineages doesn't just interbreed and disappear into the wider population, but instead ends up isolated, cut off, stranded on a small island in the middle of the ocean, left alone to follow its own evolutionary path for hundreds of thousands of years? Because that's exactly what we're going to find on an island called Flores, where the bones tell a story so strange that when scientists first saw them, more than one person in that room genuinely thought someone was playing a joke on them. There's a particular feeling that comes from standing at the edge of something and realizing the ground simply isn't there anymore. That's roughly what happened to a small team of archaeologists working on the Indonesian island of Flores in September of 2003 inside a limestone cave called Liang Bua. They had been digging in that cave for years, already searching mainly for evidence of how modern humans first made their way through Southeast Asia toward Australia. Routine work in archaeological terms. The kind of project that produces careful notes, pottery shards, the occasional stone tool's slow and steady progress that rarely makes headlines. And then about 6 meters down in sediment dated to roughly 18,000 years old, they found a skeleton, mostly complete, including a skull. And the skull was tiny, not child-sized in the way you might expect from a young individual who simply hadn't finished growing. This was an adult skeleton fully developed with worn teeth and a fused skull belonging to someone who had likely been around 30 years old when they died, and yet the whole skeleton suggested a height of roughly 3.5 feet, a little over 1 meter tall, and the brain based on the skull's interior volume was roughly the size of a grapefruit. About 420 cubic centimeters for comparison. That's less than 1/3 the size of yours or mine. For a moment, just sit with that image. An adult human being fully grown with worn-down teeth from decades of chewing, standing about as tall as a kitchen counter, with a brain smaller than some apes alive today. The researchers working on this excavation, and I think this detail says something wonderful about how science actually happens, in real life apparently looked at each other in that cave, and only half joking started calling her the Hobbit. The name stuck so thoroughly that it ended up in newspaper headlines around the world before the formal scientific name was even settled. Eventually, she and the 7 or so other individuals later found in that same cave were classified as a new species entirely, Homo floresiensis. Now here's where I want to slow down, because this is the part that genuinely keeps researchers arguing at conferences even now, more than 2 decades later. When this discovery was first announced, the leading explanation was something called island dwarfism. And if you've ever wondered why elephants on certain islands evolved into creatures barely larger than a pig, or why some island reptiles grow to enormous sizes, while island mammals often shrink, you've actually already brushed up against this concept. It's a real well-documented pattern in evolutionary biology. When a population becomes isolated on an island with limited food and few large predators over many thousands of generations, smaller body size can become a survival advantage. Less food needed, faster reproduction, an easier life on a small patch of land. Flores itself is a strange little laboratory for this kind of thing. Researchers have also found the remains of a dwarf elephant relative called Stegodon on the same island animals that had similarly shrunk down from their mainland ancestors. So the pattern of things get smaller here wasn't unprecedented for Flores. It had apparently happened before to other species. But here's the question that, if I'm honest, I find almost impossible to fully wrap my head around. Most documented cases of island dwarfism in mammals involve a reduction in body size of maybe 10, 20, perhaps 30% over very long stretches of time. What happened on Flores if this skeleton really did descend from an ancestor similar to Homo erectus, who stood somewhere around 5.5 feet tall, represents a reduction of well over 50%. And alongside that, the brain shrank even more dramatically than you'd expect just from the body size change alone. Can you imagine an entire population over generations not just getting shorter, but having their brains shrink at a rate that doesn't match anything else we've documented in mammals this size? It's one of those moments in science where the data sits there perfectly real, perfectly measured, and the explanation just doesn't quite close the loop yet. And this is where I think it's worth pausing, because the channel I'm building this story for cares deeply about getting this right. There has been over the years a small but vocal group suggesting these remains might actually represent a modern human with a pathological condition. Microcephaly, certain growth disorders, that kind of thing. It's a fair question to ask, and to be honest, it's exactly the kind of question good science should ask. But here's where the evidence has over time leaned pretty firmly in one direction. The wrist bones of these individuals show features that are frankly more similar to those of much older hominins, and even some apes, than to modern humans. The shoulder structure, the proportions of the limbs relative to the torso, even certain features of the pelvis, all of these point towards something that simply doesn't match a modern human with the disorder. And then there's the detail that for me tips the scale most heavily. It wasn't just one unusual skeleton found in that cave. Researchers have identified remains from at least several different individuals of varying ages, spanning what appears to be a population that persisted on this island for a remarkably long time. A single unusual skeleton might be an anomaly. A population with multiple individuals sharing the same unusual traits across what may have been tens of thousands of years, that's not an anomaly anymore. That's a species. So where does this leave us? Mainstream paleoanthropology today generally treats Homo floresiensis as a genuinely distinct species, likely descended from an earlier form of hominin, possibly something resembling Homo erectus, or an even older lineage that arrived on Flores at some point and then, isolated by the surrounding ocean, followed its own evolutionary path for an extraordinarily long time. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that this population may have survived until somewhere between 50 and 60,000 years ago, although, and I want to be honest with you here, the exact dates have shifted as new analysis techniques have been applied and some of the original dating has been revised more than once. Here's a detail that I think gets lost in a lot of retellings of this story, and it's the one that genuinely gives me chills every time I think about it. Modern humans, our direct ancestors, were almost certainly moving through this exact region of the world. During roughly the same window of time, these small-statured humans may have still been alive on Flores, which means somewhere in that overlap, somewhere in those thousands of years, it's entirely possible, though we have no direct proof of this, that our ancestors and this other entirely different species of human shared the same island. Maybe even saw each other. I find myself wondering what that would have looked like. Not in some dramatic cinematic confrontation, probably something far quieter, a glimpse across a clearing, footprints in mud that didn't match anything familiar. A story passed down around a fire, the kind of story that generations later gets remembered as folklore, as legend, as the small people who used to live in the hills. Because here's something that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it. Local oral traditions on Flores stories that existed long before any archaeologist set foot in that cave describe small, hairy people who once lived in the forests and caves of the island. They're often called the Ebugogo in local folklore. Now I want to be careful here because folklore is not evidence, and no serious researcher is claiming these stories are literal historical records of Homo floresiensis specifically. Scholars still debate how much, if anything, these traditions might reflect distant cultural memory versus simply being independently invented stories, the kind that show up in folklore traditions all over the world. But doesn't it give you a strange little shiver even just considering the possibility that a community might have carried a kind of folk memory passed down across hundreds of generations of sharing their world with someone, something that science would only confirm tens of thousands of years later, using methods that wouldn't exist until the 21st century. There's something almost unbearably poignant about that idea to me. The thought that an entire species of human beings who lived, hunted, raised children, and survived on that island for possibly hundreds of thousands of years might have left behind nothing more than a half-remembered story about small people in the hills. No written language, no monuments, just an echo soft enough that for most of human history, nobody could tell whether it was history or simply a story told to children at night. And if that's true here on this one small island that we happen to know about, because a research team decided to dig in exactly the right spot in exactly the right year, what does that suggest about all the other places we haven't dug yet? All the other islands, all the other caves, all the other isolated valleys, where something similar might be waiting quietly for someone to notice. Because here's the thing about Flores that I think is genuinely important to understand before we move forward tonight. For a long time, this was treated as a strange isolated curiosity, a one-off, an evolutionary oddity confined to one small island in Indonesia. And then in a cave a few thousand miles away in a completely different country, something else turned up. something that instead of closing this story would end up showing that what happened on Flores might not have been quite so unique after all. Picture for a moment a man wading into a flooded cave with nothing but a flashlight and a sense that something might be down there. That's more or less how this next piece of the story begins in a cave called Callao on the northern tip of Luzon Island in the Philippines in the year 2007. The archaeologist leading the dig was a man named Armon Salvador Mijares, and on that particular return visit the team dug down through about 8 feet of sediment, deep enough that they were well below layers containing deer bones and other animal remains from tens of thousands of years ago, and in among all of that they found a single bone, a foot bone, just one. Now on its own, a single foot bone might not sound like the kind of thing that rewrites textbooks, but this one was dated to roughly 67,000 years old, which made it at the time the oldest human remain ever found in the Philippines. And here's the thing about archaeology that I think people don't always appreciate. Sometimes the most important discoveries don't announce themselves immediately. Sometimes they just sit there quietly, while researchers spend years figuring out what they're actually looking at. It would take more than a decade and 2 more expeditions in 2011 and 2015 before the full picture started to come together. By the end of it, the team had recovered 13 fossil specimens in total, 7 teeth, a handful of finger and toe bones, and part of a thigh bone belonging to a child. 13 pieces representing at least 3 individuals, 2 adults, and 1 child who lived somewhere between 50,000 and 67,000 years ago. And when researchers finally examined what they had in 2019, they announced something that frankly I think deserved a lot more attention than it got. A brand new species of ancient human, Homo luzonensis. Now here's where I want you to lean in a little, because this is where the story stops being just another extinct cousin and starts becoming something genuinely strange. The teeth, when researchers looked closely at them, were small and relatively simple in shape. In some ways almost more modern looking than you'd expect, but one of the upper premolars had 3 roots, a trait that shows up in fewer than 3% of people alive today. Then there were the foot bones. Curved, genuinely curved in a way that suggested this individual may have still been climbing trees regularly, the kind of adaptation you'd expect from something much older, much further back on the family tree. And then there's the detail that I think is honestly the strangest of all. One of the foot bones bears a resemblance to those of Australopithecines. Now if that name sounds familiar, it might be because of someone you've probably heard of, Lucy. The famous Australopithecine skeleton found in Ethiopia belonging to a creature that walked the earth roughly 3 million years ago in the Great Rift Valley of East Africa. 3 million years. And here on an island in the Philippines, scientists were looking at a foot bone from a being that lived a mere 67,000 years ago, but which echoed features from something 3 million years removed from it. Doesn't that just completely break the mental model most of us carry around in our heads? We tend to imagine evolution as something that happens, finishes, and then we move on to the next stage, like pages turning in a book, each one replacing the last. But what Homo luzonensis seems to be telling us is that some of those old pages never actually got thrown away. They just kept getting copied quietly on some small island for millions of years while the rest of the world moved on entirely. So researchers ended up with this fossil that was, in their own words, a mosaic, a patchwork. Teeth that looked relatively modern, feet and hands that looked ancient, almost primitive, more similar to creatures from millions of years earlier than to anything from the same time period. Now you might be wondering, and I think it's a completely fair question, how does a creature end up with this kind of patchwork? Wouldn't evolution tend to move all of an organism's features forward together more or less in sync? Not necessarily. And this is where I think the story gets genuinely fascinating, because it connects to something we touched on with the small-bodied humans found on Flores different parts of the body can be under different evolutionary pressures, evolving at different rates, especially in small isolated populations, where unusual traits can spread quickly, simply because there aren't very many individuals to begin with. On a small island with a small population, certain features can drift in directions that would be far less likely in a larger, more connected population on a mainland. And here's the detail that for me turns this from an interesting scientific footnote into something that feels almost cinematic. The time frame for Homo luzonensis, somewhere between 50,000 and 67,000 years ago, means this small tree-climbing, patchwork species of human was alive at the exact same time as Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Siberia and Tibet, the small, statured humans on Flores that we just spent time with, and our own direct ancestors, modern humans who were spreading across the planet during that very same window. Stop and think about that for a second. At one single point in time, not spread across millions of years, but overlapping at least 5 distinct kinds of human beings were alive on this planet at once. 5. Can you imagine what a map of the world would have looked like back then if you could somehow color-code it by which kind of human lived where? Because right now, today, there's exactly one, and here's a question I genuinely find myself sitting with. What happened to all of them? Not in some single dramatic event, but slowly, quietly, over tens of thousands of years. Did they simply get absorbed generation by generation into larger populations of modern humans, the way we know happened with Neanderthals and Denisovans? Or did some of them on these small isolated islands simply run out of room, run out of time and fade away, without anyone ever knowing they existed at all, until someone happened to dig in exactly the right spot? Because here's the part of this discovery that I think is the most quietly devastating if you really sit with it. Homo luzonensis is known from 13 bones. 13, a handful of teeth, a few fingers, a few toes, part of a child's thigh bone. That's it. That's the entire physical record so far of an entire species of human beings who may have lived on that island for hundreds of thousands of years. And researchers have not been able to extract any usable DNA from these remains at all, not a trace. Which means, unlike the Denisovans, whose genetic fingerprints we can trace into the bodies of people living today, Homo luzonensis exist for now only as bones, silent, with no way yet to know whether any part of them lives on in any of us. Now here's something that I think connects this story back to where we started tonight in a way that genuinely gives me chills. Remember that mysterious genetic signal we talked about earlier? The so-called southern Denisovans, whose DNA shows up strongly in people living in places like Papua New Guinea and parts of Australia, but whose actual bones have never been found anywhere in that region. What if, and I want to be careful here because this is genuinely at the edge of what current science can tell us, what if some of that missing genetic signal doesn't belong to Denisovans at all in the way we usually think of them? What if some small part of it belongs to populations like this one on Luzon, or others like it scattered across islands we haven't excavated yet? Populations that interbred with modern humans, left a trace in our DNA, and then simply vanished from the fossil record entirely, leaving behind nothing but an echo in our genes and 13 bones in a cave. Scholars still debate this, and I want to be honest with you, there's no settled answer here. But doesn't it change the way you think about that empty space on the map? Because right now we have a genetic signal with no body, and a body with no genetic signal, and somewhere on some island in some cave that nobody has dug into yet, there might be the missing piece that finally connects the two. And that, as it turns out, is exactly the kind of question that sent researchers looking in an entirely different direction. Not at bones buried in the ground at all, but at the DNA of people who are alive right now, walking around living their lives completely unaware that their own genome might be the closest thing we have to a map of a world that vanished before anyone thought to write it down. There's a strange kind of detective work that doesn't involve any digging at all. No shovels, no caves, no careful brushing away of dirt. Just a laboratory, a computer, and a string of letters representing the genetic code of someone who is right now very much alive. And that's exactly where this part of our story takes us. Away from caves, away from bones, and into the bloodstream of people living today in places like Papua New Guinea and the Highlands, and along the coastlines of islands scattered across what scientists call Wallacea, the stretch of ocean, and islands between mainland Asia and Australia. Here's a number that when I first came across it genuinely stopped me for a moment. If you happen to be of Papuan descent, somewhere between 4 and 6% of your entire genome can be traced back to Denisovans. Now, we touched on Denisovans earlier in this story, that mysterious cousin known mostly from a tiny finger bone in a Siberian cave and a jawbone discovered on the Tibetan plateau. But here's the question that once you ask it becomes very hard to stop thinking about. How does someone living on a tropical island thousands of miles from Siberia end up carrying more Denisovan DNA than almost anyone else on the planet? For a long time, researchers assumed there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Denisovans had a wide range stretching from Siberia all the way down through Southeast Asia. Maybe ancestors of modern Papuans passed through that range on their journey south, picked up some Denisovan ancestry along the way you might pick up a souvenir while passing through an airport. Simple, tidy, done. Except the more closely scientists looked, the less tidy it became. In 2019, a team of researchers did something that sounds almost like science fiction. They took genetic data from over 160 people across 14 different island groups in Southeast Asia and New Guinea, and they essentially built a kind of map painting each person's genome in different colours, depending on which ancient lineage each segment of DNA came from. Picture a quilt stitched together from fabric scraps of many different colours, except each colour represents a different chapter of human ancestry, and when they finished painting that quilt, something didn't add up. The Denisovan-looking segments weren't all the same colour. They found large stretches of DNA that simply couldn't have come from a single Denisovan population. Instead, modern Papuans appear to carry genetic material from at least 2 genuinely distinct Denisovan lineages groups that have been separated from each other for more than 350,000 years before either of them ever met a modern human. 350,000 years. For context, that's roughly the same amount of time separating the very first Homo sapiens from the people listening to this story right now. 2 completely different branches of Denisovans evolving separately for that entire span of time, both of them eventually meeting and mixing with the ancestors of people living in Papua New Guinea today. So here's the picture that starts to emerge. It's not one Denisovan population with a wide range. It looks more like multiple separate populations of Denisovans, each evolving in their own corner of Asia, each eventually crossing paths with modern humans moving through the region, probably at different times in different places. And this is where the story takes a turn that I think deserves a moment of genuine pause. Because if there were multiple Denisovan populations scattered across Asia, interbreeding with modern humans in multiple different locations, then logically their physical remains, their bones, their teeth should also be scattered across multiple locations. And yet outside of that handful of fragments from Siberia and Tibet, we have found essentially nothing. No bones in the Philippines, no bones in Indonesia, no bones anywhere near the islands where their genetic legacy is strongest. This is the gap that researchers have started referring to as the Southern Denisovans. Not a single missing person, but potentially an entire missing population, or populations who left behind a genetic signature strong enough to still be measurable in the DNA of millions of people today, and yet left behind no physical trace that anyone has managed to find. Can you imagine that for a moment somewhere out there hidden in the genomes of people living their everyday lives right now, raising children, going to work, falling asleep tonight just like you, there's a kind of map. A map written in DNA instead of ink, showing where ancient populations once lived, who they met and when. And yet if you tried to overlay that genetic map onto an actual physical map of fossil discoveries, large parts of it would simply be blank, empty space where the genetic evidence says something significant happened, but where archaeology has so far found nothing at all. Now in 2025, a separate piece of this puzzle came into focus, and I think it's worth sitting with because it actually closes one possibility while opening up another. For years, some researchers had wondered whether the high Denisovan ancestry in Papuans might be explained by an entirely different, much older population, sometimes called a ghost lineage, descended from a very early migration out of Africa, long before the main wave that gave rise to most non-African populations today. A team using deep learning models trained on genomic data tested this idea directly, and the results were in their own words fairly clear. There simply wasn't room statistically for a large contribution from that kind of separate ancient population. If something like that did exist, its genetic signal had been almost entirely absorbed or overwritten by later waves of ancestry, in a strange way that actually makes the Denisovan mystery sharper, not softer. It rules out one explanation and leaves the Denisovan signal standing there unexplained, asking the same question it always has. Where are these people? And here's something that for me makes this whole situation feel less like an abstract scientific puzzle and more like an actual unfinished story with real people in it. In 2021, researchers studying an ancient skeleton found on the island of Sulawesi, a woman who lived roughly 7,000 years ago, found that she carried about 2% Denisovan DNA. Her ancestors had apparently interbred with Denisovans, who were already living on that island before her own ancestors continued their journey toward what would eventually become Papua New Guinea and Australia. So somewhere on Sulawesi, thousands of years before this woman was even born, a Denisovan population was living, breathing, raising families in a place where today not a single Denisovan bone has ever been recovered. We know they were there only because of what they left behind in someone else's descendants. I find something quietly moving in that. These weren't just genetic ghosts in some abstract sense, they were neighbours. For some communities of early modern humans moving through these islands, Denisovans weren't a mystery. From deep time, they were simply for a while part of the world. People you might trade with live near, occasionally marry into your family, and then over generations as modern human populations grew larger and spread further, these Denisovan communities seem to have simply faded from the historical record, entirely leaving their genes behind as the only evidence they were ever here at all. So here's the question I want to leave hanging in the air for a moment, because I think it's the kind of question that's worth turning over slowly, the way you might turn over a stone on a beach without quite knowing what's underneath it. If an entire population of ancient humans can leave a genetic signature strong enough to still be measurable in millions of people today, and yet leave behind not a single bone that anyone has found, what does that actually tell us about how much of human history might still be sitting out there unread, written only in the DNA of people who have absolutely no idea they're carrying it? Because as it turns out, there's one place where scientists have actually started to find some answers to exactly that question. Not in a cave, not in a laboratory, but in a small, quiet community of people living on the very same island where our hobbits once lived. An island where modern human bodies seem to be telling a story of their own. There's a small village on the island of Flores called Rampasasa, just a short walk from the cave, where 20 years ago researchers pulled that tiny skeleton out of the ground and only half-jokingly started calling her a hobbit. And in this village today, right now, while you're listening to this, there are people living their lives whose average height is around 4.5 feet tall. Now, if you were a geneticist and you'd just spent years studying the bones of an extinct species of small humans found a few kilometers away, what would be the very first question running through your mind walking into that village? I think most of us would assume the same thing the scientists initially wondered. Could these be their descendants? Could the people of Rampasasa be carrying somewhere in their bodies a living echo of those ancient hobbits? In 2013, a geneticist named Serena Tucci travelled to Rampasasa as part of a research team from Princeton University. And I love this detail because it grounds the whole story in something so wonderfully human. She described sitting in a room full of male researchers and pygmy villagers, smoke from clove cigarettes drifting through the air, being offered palm wine made from the sap of nearby trees, while translators worked through 3 different languages just to explain what the researchers were hoping to do. And once the villagers understood, Tucci said they were genuinely excited. They wanted to know the same thing the scientists wanted to know. Were they descendants of the ancient people who once lived in that cave? Here's the problem though, and it's a problem that honestly sounds almost impossible to work around. Despite years of trying, researchers have never been able to extract usable DNA from the original hobbit remains. The tropical climate on Flores is brutal on ancient genetic material. It simply breaks down too quickly in that heat and humidity. So there was no hobbit genome to compare anything to, no genetic fingerprint to search for. So what do you do when the very thing you need to compare against simply doesn't exist? The team working in a lab led by Joshua Eki came up with something I think is genuinely clever. If you can't compare directly to the ancient species, you compare to everything you do have and see what's left over. They took the genomes of 32 modern Rampasasa villagers, including 10 complete genome sequences, and essentially painted each piece of every genome according to where it came from. Sequences that match typical modern human DNA painted one colour. Sequences that matched known Neanderthal DNA another colour. Sequences matching known Denisovan DNA a third colour. And anything left over, anything that didn't match any of those, got labelled simply as unknown. If the Rampasasa villagers really were descendants of the ancient hobbits, Tucci reasoned then those unknown sequences should look distinctly older than the Neanderthal and Denisovan sequences, genetically ancient in a way that would set them apart. And here's where the story takes a turn that I'll be honest surprised even the researchers. When they finished painting the genome and stepped back to look at the picture, the unknown sequences weren't there, not in any meaningful way. What they found instead was exactly what you'd expect from an ordinary modern human population. Plenty of Neanderthal ancestry, a small amount of Denisovan ancestry, consistent with what's found elsewhere in that region, and essentially nothing else. The conclusion published in the journal Science in 2018 was about as clear as genetics ever gets. The modern people of Rampasasa are not descended from the ancient hobbits. 2 entirely separate populations of small-statured humans lived on the exact same island near the exact same cave, separated by tens of thousands of years, and they are not related to each other at all. Now here's where I think this story becomes something more than just a tidy answer to one question, because it raises a much bigger, much stranger question in its place. If the ancient hobbits and the modern pygmies of Flores aren't related, then why do they look so similar? Why does this same small patch of land, this one island in Indonesia, seem to produce small humans not once but twice, completely independently separated by an enormous span of time? The researchers actually have an answer for this, and it's one of those answers that once you hear it makes you look at the whole planet a little differently. Flores, like a lot of islands, appears to have a kind of evolutionary pull towards smaller body size. We touched briefly on the dwarf elephants that once lived alongside the ancient hobbits animals that shrank down from much larger ancestors after generations of island living. And it seems modern humans, when they eventually settled on Flores, experienced something similar. Limited resources, a particular environment, and over generations smaller bodies became more common, not because of any ancient hobbit DNA passed down, but because the island itself seems to nudge populations in that direction regardless of who's living there. One of the researchers put it in a way that I think is genuinely beautiful and a little humbling. She said this finding shows that evolutionarily speaking, we're not actually that special. Humans are subject to the same pressures, the same processes as every other mammal. Put a population of large animals on a small island for long enough, and there's a good chance, whether they're elephants or humans, that their descendants will end up smaller than where they started. Twice on the same island, completely independently. That's not a coincidence born of shared ancestry. That's just what islands do. I find something almost poetic in that idea. The island didn't remember the hobbits. It didn't pass anything down to the people living there now. It simply did again what it had apparently done once before, with a completely different population, completely independently separated by tens of thousands of years, as if the land itself has a kind of quiet pattern it keeps returning to. But here's the detail that I think deserves one more moment of your attention before we move on, because it connects directly back to everything we've been building tonight. Remember, the modern people of Rampersesa do carry Denisovan DNA. Not a huge amount, but a real measurable amount consistent with the broader pattern we talked about earlier in people across this region. So even though this particular population has no connection to the ancient hobbits who once lived nearby, they are still in their own way carrying pieces of that other ancient story. The story of populations meeting, mixing, leaving traces behind in each other's descendants over and over again all across these islands, in patterns that are only now starting to come into focus. So here's where that leaves us. We have ancient hobbits with no DNA we can study at all. We have modern pygmies with DNA we can study perfectly well, but who turn out to share no ancestry with those hobbits. And somewhere underneath both of these stories there's still that broader genetic signal we talked about earlier, those traces of Denisovan ancestry spread unevenly across this entire region, with the actual Denisovan population that left it behind still nowhere to be found. It's almost as if every time science manages to close one door in this story, it quietly opens two more. And honestly, I think that's exactly why this region of the world, these islands, these caves, these small forgotten villages, have become one of the most genuinely exciting places in all of human evolutionary research right now. Because if a population of ancient humans can leave behind a genetic fingerprint clear enough to identify, and a modern population living right next door can carry no trace of it whatsoever, then somewhere between those two extremes there's an enormous amount of human history that simply hasn't been written down yet. And the next piece of that puzzle, as it turns out, comes from a place that looks at this entire mystery from the opposite direction. Not by asking who left their DNA behind, but by asking quite directly whether any of these ancient meetings between different kinds of humans actually happened at all. Sometimes the most interesting thing a piece of research can tell you isn't what it found, it's what it didn't find. And tonight I want to walk you through a study that on the surface sounds almost like a story about failure. Scientists went looking for something, searched incredibly hard for it, and came back essentially empty-handed. Except in this particular case, that empty-handed result might be one of the most quietly important findings in this entire mystery. In 2021, a team of researchers led by the University of Adelaide, working alongside the Natural History Museum in London, set out to answer a question that by this point in our story tonight, you've probably already started wondering about yourself. We've talked about Denisovans. We've talked about the tiny hobbits of Flores. We've talked about Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. All of these different kinds of ancient humans living in roughly the same part of the world, roughly the same window of time somewhere between 50 and 60,000 years ago, right as modern humans were arriving in the region. So here's the obvious question. If our ancestors interbred with Neanderthals in Europe and with Denisovans in Siberia and Tibet, did they also interbreed with these other ancient humans, the ones whose bones we've actually found right there in Southeast Asia, in the exact place and time where everything seems to overlap? It seems like such a reasonable thing to expect, doesn't it? We already know modern humans weren't shy about this sort of thing. We've spent this entire story talking about how often these ancient lineages mix together. So researchers gathered genetic data from over 400 modern humans, more than 200 of them, from people living across the islands of Southeast Asia and New Guinea, and they went looking for genetic signatures, fingerprints that would indicate interbreeding with Homo erectus, with Homo floresiensis, or with Homo luzonensis. And what they found was nothing, not a trace, not a hint, not even a faint ambiguous signal that might suggest something happened a very long time ago and got mostly washed out. The genetic record as far as these three known species are concerned is essentially silent. Now here's where I think this gets genuinely fascinating, because this same study did confirm once again that high levels of Denisovan ancestry exist throughout this exact region. So the researchers weren't bad at finding genetic traces of ancient interbreeding in general. They found plenty of evidence for Denisovans. They just found absolutely nothing connecting any of that evidence to the actual fossils that have been dug up in this part of the world. Dr. João Teixeira, one of the lead researchers on this study, put it about as plainly as a scientist ever does. He said the levels of Denisovan DNA in people living in this region clearly show that significant interbreeding happened in island Southeast Asia. And then he asked the question that I think is the real heart of everything we've been exploring tonight. Why haven't we found their fossils alongside the other ancient humans in the region? Sit with that for a second, because I want you to really feel the shape of this problem. On one hand, you have a region with one of the richest fossil records of human evolution anywhere on the planet, spanning over 1.5 million years. Bones from Homo erectus, bones from the Flores hobbits, bones from Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. An incredible deep-layered record of ancient humans living in this part of the world for an enormous span of time. And on the other hand, you have genetic evidence sitting right there in the DNA of millions of people alive today, proving beyond reasonable doubt that modern humans interbred extensively with some other group of ancient humans in this exact same region, during this exact same window of time. And these two enormous bodies of evidence simply do not connect to each other at all. It's almost like having two halves of a photograph. One half shows you the room, the other half shows you a person's shadow falling across the floor. But no matter how carefully you try to line them up, the shadow never quite matches anyone standing in the room. Now here's a thought that occurred to me while I was researching this, and I think it's worth voicing because I suspect a lot of you might be thinking something similar. Could the explanation just be simpler than all of this? Could it be that Homo erectus, or the Flores hobbits, or Homo luzonensis are actually the southern Denisovans just under a different name, and we simply haven't connected the dots yet because we don't have their DNA to compare? It's a genuinely tempting idea. And to their credit, the researchers addressed this directly. Chris Stringer from the Natural History Museum offered what I think is the most sobering piece of this entire puzzle. He pointed out that while these known fossil species might seem at first glance to be in the right place and the right time to be the mysterious southern Denisovans, their ancestors were likely already present in this region at least 700,000 years ago. 700,000 years. That's an extraordinarily long time for a population to remain isolated, evolving completely separately, before modern humans ever interbred with the Denisovans whose DNA we're finding in living people today. In other words, the timing doesn't quite fit either. These species had simply been on their own evolutionary path for too long, branching off too early to neatly match what the genetic data is telling us about more recent interbreeding events. So where does that leave us? Honestly, it leaves us with the genuinely open question, the kind that doesn't come along very often in science. Either there's an entire group of ancient humans living in this region, whose fossils we simply haven't found yet, hidden in some cave on some island waiting for someone to dig in exactly the right spot. Or, and this is the possibility I personally find even more interesting, some of the fossils we already have sitting in museum drawers right now might need to be looked at again with fresh eyes using techniques that didn't exist when they were first studied. Can you imagine being the researcher who picks up a bone that's been sitting in a museum collection for decades, a bone everyone assumed they already understood, and discovering that it's actually evidence of exactly the population everyone has been searching for? I think what strikes me most about this particular study isn't the absence of an answer, it's what that absence represents. In most areas of science, when you run a careful study and come back with a clear negative result, that's often treated as the end of the conversation. Nothing here, move along. But in this case, the negative result didn't close the door on this mystery. If anything, it kicked it wide open because it ruled out the easiest, most obvious explanations and left us with a genuine unsolved puzzle sitting right there in plain sight in one of the most thoroughly studied regions of human evolutionary history on the entire planet. And once you start looking at this region through that lens, once you accept that the genetic map and the fossil map of this part of the world simply don't line up yet, it starts to feel less like a finished mystery and more like an active investigation. One where the next major clue could come from absolutely anywhere. A cave that hasn't been excavated. A bone that's already been found but never properly examined. A genome from a community that's never been sequenced before. And that's exactly where this story goes next, because while some researchers have been searching for missing bones, others have taken a completely different approach. Instead of asking where the southern Denisovans might be buried, they've started asking a much stranger question. What if the clearest evidence we have left isn't buried at all? What if it's been hiding this entire time in plain sight, inside the bodies of people living in some of the highest, harshest places on Earth? There's a small detail in this next part of the story that I think about more than almost anything else we've covered tonight. A tiny gene 4 letters long as a name that somehow connects a cave in Siberia to the lungs of people living 3.5 miles above sea level on the other side of a mountain range in a place those Siberian cave dwellers almost certainly never set foot. The gene is called EPAS1. And before you let your eyes glaze over at the sound of that, stay with me for just a moment, because I promise you, this is one of the most quietly remarkable stories in all of human genetics. For years, scientists studying the people of Tibet had been puzzled by something. Tibetans live generation after generation at altitudes above 11,000 feet on a plateau where the air contains significantly less oxygen than at sea level. Most people dropped onto that plateau without time to adjust would struggle. Headaches, fatigue, in severe cases something called altitude sickness that can become dangerous quite quickly. The usual way human bodies cope with low oxygen over the long term is to produce more red blood cells, thickening the blood to carry more oxygen. But here's the thing, that solution comes with a cost. Thicker blood increases the risk of cardiovascular problems, and for pregnant women it's linked to serious complications. So if you're going to live at that altitude for generation after generation, that standard fix isn't really sustainable. And yet Tibetans do live there, generation after generation. without those same health problems showing up at anywhere near the rate you'd expect. So researchers went looking for why, and when they examined the EPAS1 gene, the gene responsible for regulating how the body responds to low oxygen, they found something in Tibetans that looked almost nothing like the version of that gene found in other populations. A version that, instead of triggering that thick blood response, helps the body cope with low oxygen in a gentler way, one that doesn't carry the same long-term risks. Now here's where this story takes the turn that I think genuinely deserves a moment of quiet astonishment. When researchers compared this unusual version of EPAS1 to every other human population, they could find it didn't match anything. Not East Asians broadly, not South Asians, not Europeans. It was almost entirely absent everywhere except in Tibetans, and at a very low frequency in some Han Chinese individuals living near Tibet. So where did it come from? The answer when it came was almost too perfect for a bedtime story like this one. Researchers compared this unusual Tibetan version of EPAS1 to the Denisovan genome, the one reconstructed from that tiny finger bone in Siberia that we talked about earlier in this story. And it matched. Not approximately, almost exactly. One of the lead researchers on this, a scientist named Rasmus Nielsen, put it about as directly as a scientist ever does. He said that part of the EPAS1 gene in Tibetans is almost identical to the gene found in Denisovans, and very different from everyone else, and that statistically there's simply no other way to explain the data, except through inheritance from Denisovans. Now here's a detail that I think makes this even stranger in the best possible way. Remember earlier in this story we talked about how people in Papua New Guinea and Melanesia carry by far the highest percentage of Denisovan ancestry of any population on Earth, somewhere around 4 to 6% of their entire genome. And yet this particular Denisovan gene, this exact version of EPAS1 that helps with high-altitude survival, isn't found in those populations at all. So think about what that actually means. The population with the most Denisovan DNA overall doesn't have this specific gene, but a population with comparatively very little Denisovan ancestry overall, Tibetans, carries this one specific Denisovan gene almost universally. Why would that be? Well, here's where I think the explanation becomes almost beautiful in a quietly logical sort of way. Imagine this gene entered the ancestral population of East Asians a very long time ago, as part of a broader, smaller-scale mixing event with Denisovans separate from the much larger mixing event that happened with the ancestors of people in New Guinea. For most of the people who carried this gene, it probably didn't matter very much. If you're living at sea level, a gene that helps you cope with low oxygen doesn't really give you any particular advantage. It's just there, quietly sitting in the genome, neither helping nor hurting generation after generation. But then at some point, some group of people carrying that gene made their way onto the Tibetan plateau, and suddenly that quiet, unremarkable little gene became one of the single, most important pieces of DNA a person could possibly have. People who had it could live, raise families, survive pregnancies in an environment that would be a constant physiological struggle for almost everyone else on the planet. And so, over generations, that gene spread not because it was new, but because the environment finally asked the question it had been waiting tens of thousands of years to answer. I find something genuinely moving about that idea. A gift passed down from a population that no longer exists, sitting dormant in human DNA for tens of thousands of years, doing essentially nothing. And then one day, a group of people walk into the one environment on the entire planet where that gift suddenly becomes the difference between thriving and struggling. It's almost as if the Denisovans left behind a key generations before anyone built the door it was meant to open. And here's a question I want to leave with you for a moment because I think it's worth sitting with. How many other genes like this might be quietly tucked away in human populations around the world, right now doing nothing, waiting genes inherited from Denisovans or Neanderthals, or perhaps from those mysterious southern populations we've spent so much of tonight trying to find genes that simply haven't met their moment yet, because the environment that would make them matter hasn't been encountered or hasn't existed in tens of thousands of years. Because here's the thing about inheritance in the genetic sense. It's not always about what's useful right now. Sometimes it's about what gets carried forward quietly, generation after generation, completely unremarkable, until one day, for reasons nobody could have predicted, it suddenly becomes the most important thing about you. And if a single gene from an extinct species can shape something as fundamental as how an entire population breathes at altitude, then it raises a question that I think deserves real attention. If the Denisovans left behind gifts like this scattered quietly through human populations across Asia and the Pacific, what about those other ancient lineages we've been searching for tonight, the ones whose bones we still haven't found? Could they have left behind gifts of their own, hiding in plain sight in the bodies of people who have absolutely no idea they're carrying them? And if so, where would we even begin to look? Because as it turns out, that question doesn't just lead back into the past. It leads somewhere far more immediate into the actual living populations scattered across these islands. Today, people whose bodies right now might be quietly holding on to pieces of human history that no fossil record will ever be able to show us. There's something about the Arctic that for most of us exists almost entirely as an idea. A place we picture from documentaries all white and blue and impossibly cold, somewhere so far removed from daily life that it barely feels real. And yet that's exactly where this next part of our story takes us, to one of the coldest, harshest environments human beings have ever managed to call home. We've spent a lot of time tonight in caves and on tropical islands, places where the climate is warm, where ancient humans were dealing with rainforests and ocean crossings. So I want you to imagine something completely different now. Imagine the Greenland ice sheet. Imagine temperatures that for months at a time rarely climb above freezing. Imagine a diet built almost entirely around fish and marine mammals, because very little else can grow there. And now imagine trying to survive there generation after generation for thousands of years. In 2015, researchers conducted the first detailed genomic study of Greenlandic Inuit populations, looking for signs of natural selection genetic changes that had clearly been favoured over time because they helped people survive in this environment. And they found something. 2 regions of the genome that stood out dramatically from what you'd find in almost any other population on Earth. One of those regions involved a cluster of genes related to how the body processes fatty acids, which honestly makes a certain intuitive sense if you think about a diet built around fish and marine mammals. But the other region was in some ways even more interesting. It involved 2 genes called TBX15 and WARS2, both of which are connected to how the body distributes fat and generates heat. Now here's where this gets genuinely fascinating, because a follow-up study went digging into where this particular variant actually came from. And researchers led by a scientist named Fernando Racimo found that this version of the gene region in Inuit populations matched very closely the same region in the Denisovan genome. Denisovans. Again. The same mysterious cousin whose finger bone we started this whole story with all those caves and islands ago. Think about the geography here for a moment, because I think it's genuinely staggering once you actually sit with it. The Denisovan fossils we have come from Siberia and Tibet. The Inuit populations carrying this gene live in Greenland and across the Arctic regions of North America. That's an almost unimaginable distance, and yet somewhere in the deep past, ancestors of these Arctic populations apparently picked up this particular genetic variant from Denisovans, or a population closely related to them, and carried it with them across Siberia, across the Bering Land Bridge into a completely different hemisphere, where it eventually became one of the genetic foundations of how their descendants survive extreme cold today. Doesn't that completely reshape how you think about migration? We tend to imagine ancient human movement as this slow, gradual, spreading outward populations drifting from one place to another over thousands of years. And that's true. But what this tells us is that these populations weren't just carrying themselves forward. They were carrying an entire genetic toolkit accumulated from multiple ancient relatives along the way, like travelers picking up useful equipment at every stop on a very, very long journey, and then handing that equipment down to their descendants, who would eventually need it in a place none of their ancestors had ever seen. And here's something that I think connects this directly back to the Tibetan story we just explored in a way that I find genuinely beautiful. In Tibet, we saw a Denisovan gene that helps the body cope with low oxygen at high altitude. Here in the Arctic, we're seeing a different Denisovan gene helping the body cope with extreme cold by regulating fat and generating heat. Two completely different environments, two completely different survival challenges, and in both cases, part of the solution appears to trace back to the same extinct population. What does that tell us about the Denisovans themselves? It suggests they weren't just living in one narrow environment. The evidence increasingly points toward multiple Denisovan populations, adapted to different conditions scattered across a wide range of Asia, from cold mountainous regions to potentially warmer environments further south, the ones we spent so much time searching for earlier tonight. Each of these populations over hundreds of thousands of years would have developed their own genetic solutions to their own local environments. And then when modern humans arrived and interbred with them, some of those solutions got passed along like a kind of inheritance, waiting patiently for descendants who would eventually need exactly that. And it doesn't stop with fat metabolism and oxygen processing. More recent research has also identified Denisovan-derived variants affecting a cluster of immune system genes, ones involved in detecting bacteria, fungi, and parasites. People who carry these particular Denisovan versions show higher activity of these immune receptors in their white blood cells, which means in some populations part of how your immune system recognizes and responds to certain pathogens might literally be a hand-me-down from an extinct relative who faced different diseases in a different environment tens of thousands of years before you were born. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment because I think it's one of the most quietly profound things in this entire story. Your immune system. The thing working right now while you're listening to this to figure out what little disturbances need a small response and what need a bigger one. Parts of that system in many people were shaped at least in part by encounters between modern humans and an entirely different species encounters that happened so long ago that the people who actually experienced them have no descendants left who remember it ever happening. So here's a question I keep coming back to, and maybe you've been wondering something similar tonight. If Denisovans left behind a gene for breathing at altitude in Tibet, and a gene for staying warm in the Arctic, and genes that shape immune function in populations across Asia, scattered across environments thousands of miles apart from each other and from where their actual bones have been found, then how many separate populations of Denisovans must there have been? How widely must they have ranged across how many different climates for their genetic legacy to show up in so many wildly different corners of the human story? And here's the part that I think ties this entire evening together. Every single one of these discoveries, the altitude gene in Tibet, the cold adaptation genes in the Arctic, the immune variants scattered across Asia, every one of them was found the exact same way. Not by digging up a Denisovan skeleton in Greenland or finding Denisovan bones on the Tibetan plateau. They were found by looking at the DNA of people who are alive right now today, people who have absolutely no idea that a small part of what makes their body work the way it does came from a relative that vanished from the fossil record so completely that in most of these places we don't even know they were ever there at all, except for what they left behind in their descendants. Which brings us, I think, to the question that this entire story has really been circling around from the very beginning. If the evidence is there written into the bodies of living people in Tibet, in Greenland, on islands, across the Pacific, scattered across environments as different as anything on this planet, then what does the map of human history actually look like once you stop drawing it, based on where we've found bones, and start drawing it based on where these genes actually are? Because that map, as it turns out, doesn't look anything like the simple tidy diagrams most of us grew up with. It looks like something else entirely. And piecing that map together, even just the small part of it we've managed to sketch out so far, is exactly where this story has to go next. In 2022, a team of researchers at Oxford did something that when I first read about it genuinely made me put down what I was reading and just sit there for a minute. They built a family tree. Not a small one, not a single bloodline going back a few hundred years. They built what they called a unified genealogy, connecting more than 3,000 human genomes, both modern and ancient, into a single, sprawling structure that attempts to map out as best as current science can where our ancestors actually were at different points across the last several 100,000 years. Now I want you to picture this for a second because I think the image itself is worth sitting with. Imagine a kind of living map of the world, except instead of showing countries or cities, it shows little points of light, each one representing a group of ancestors, all of them slowly drifting and clustering and spreading across the globe as you move forward through time. The team, led by a researcher named Anthony Woons, essentially built that map using genetic data as the raw material, and for the most part what came out matched what we already knew. The map confirmed the broad outlines of the human migration out of Africa, the kind of story that's been pieced together over decades of archaeology and genetics, which honestly is itself a remarkable achievement, a kind of validation that this method actually works. But then there were a few details in that map that didn't fit. A few points of light that showed up in places they really genuinely shouldn't have been. Here's the one that I keep coming back to. According to this genetic family tree, by around 140,000 years ago, a noticeable cluster of ancestors appears to have been located in Papua New Guinea. Now, if you've been with me through this whole story tonight, you might already feel the shape of the problem here. The earliest archaeological evidence we have for modern humans actually living in Papua New Guinea dates to somewhere around 40 to 50,000 years ago. This genetic map is suggesting ancestors were there roughly 100,000 years before that. 100,000 years. Let that sink in for a second. That's not a small discrepancy you can wave away as a rounding error in some dating method. That's an enormous gap, the kind of gap that, if it's real, suggests something is happening in this story that nobody has fully accounted for yet. So what's going on? Well, the researchers themselves were careful here, and I think their caution is actually one of the most honest, most human parts of this whole story. They didn't claim that modern humans were definitely walking around Papua New Guinea 100,000 years before anyone thought. Instead, they offered a few possible explanations, and I find each of them in its own way kind of breathtaking. One possibility is that this result reflects something called a ghost population. Remember that term from earlier tonight. A group of ancestors who existed who contributed genetically to people living in this region today, but who themselves left no other trace, no fossils, no other genetic signal anywhere else. Just this one strange echo showing up in a family tree built from modern DNA. But here's the other possibility the researchers raised, and this is the one that for me ties this entire story together in a way I genuinely did not expect when I started researching this video. They suggested this signal could be consistent with the presence of deeply diverged Denisovan lineages, specifically the kind that we now know are unique to Papuan populations, Denisovans, again, showing up once more in a completely different kind of evidence using a completely different method in the exact same place where we've been finding genetic puzzles all night. Now here's a question I think is worth pausing on. We started this story with a single finger bone in Siberia. We've followed genetic threads to Tibet to the Arctic, across islands in Southeast Asia, and now to a massive computational family tree built from thousands of genomes at Oxford. And at almost every single turn, no matter what method researchers use, no matter what angle they approach this from, they keep running into the same thing. Evidence pointing toward ancient populations in this region of the world, populations whose genetic legacy is undeniable, and whose physical remains remain frustratingly completely absent. Doesn't that start to feel like more than coincidence? At what point does a pattern like this stop being a series of separate mysteries and start looking like one single enormous mystery viewed from many different angles? And here's something else from this same study that I think deserves a moment because it's almost a mirror image of the Papua New Guinea puzzle, just in a different part of the world. The same family tree suggested that ancestral lineages were present in the Americas by around 56,000 years ago, significantly earlier than the timelines most archaeologists currently accept for when humans first arrived in the Americas. Now, the researchers were careful to point out that this doesn't necessarily mean people were physically living in the Americas that early. It might instead reflect something more subtle ancestors who existed at that time in some other location, whose descendants simply ended up generations later being the people who eventually settled in the Americas. In other words, the genetic signal can sometimes point to where an ancestor's descendants ended up living, even if that specific ancestor never set foot there themselves. But even with that more cautious interpretation, I think there's something genuinely thought-provoking here. This new method, built from thousands of genomes working purely from mathematics and statistics, with no fossils involved at all, kept producing results that didn't quite match the conventional timeline. Not just once in one place, but in at least two completely different regions of the world. I find myself wondering, and maybe you're wondering this too, what happens as this method gets refined further? The researchers themselves said this was just an initial version built from a few thousand genomes, and that future versions could potentially incorporate millions. What happens when that map gets sharper? When more of those points of light resolve into something clearer? Because here's the thing about a map like this. Right now it's a little bit like looking at a very old photograph that's slightly out of focus. You can tell there's something there in certain spots, something that doesn't quite match what you expected to see. But you can't quite make out the details, and the temptation, I think, especially in popular science storytelling, is to either dismiss those blurry spots entirely or to leap straight to the most dramatic possible explanation. But I think the honest and, frankly, the most exciting position to sit in is somewhere in between. These blurry spots are real. They're not noise, they're not errors, they're showing up consistently across multiple independent lines of evidence in some of the same locations over and over again, and we genuinely don't know yet what they represent. What we do know is this. Somewhere in the deep past, in the islands and coastlines of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, something happened. Populations existed there, interacted there, left genetic traces there that don't fully match the story we've been telling about human history for the last several decades. And whether the answer turns out to be an undiscovered Denisovan population, an entirely separate ghost lineage nobody has named yet, or something we haven't even thought to look for, the evidence keeps pointing again and again to the exact same blank spaces on the map, and I think that's actually a wonderful place for us to be as a species right now. Because it means the story of where we come from isn't finished. It's not a closed book sitting on a shelf, somewhere fully written, just waiting for us to read the last page. It's still being written right now in laboratories, in universities in caves that haven't been dug yet, and in the quiet, ordinary DNA of people who have absolutely no idea they're carrying the next chapter inside them. And that, I think, brings us to a good place to step back just for a moment and look at everything we've gathered tonight, all these scattered pieces, these caves and islands and genes and family trees, and ask what it all adds up to when you finally lay it all out together. So here we are. We started tonight in a cold cave in Siberia with a bone fragment smaller than a coin, and somehow hours later we've travelled through Tibet, through tropical islands in Indonesia and the Philippines, into the icy stretches of Greenland, and into computer models trying to map ancestors across hundreds of thousands of years. And if there's one thread running through all of it, I think it's this. The story of human history isn't really a story about the past at all. It's a story about us right now, carrying pieces of that past inside us, mostly without ever knowing it. Let's just take a moment to gently gather everything together. We started with the Denisovans, a population we know existed mainly because of what they left behind, in the bodies of living people, more than the bones they left in the ground. A single finger bone, a jawbone found by a monk, and yet somehow an entire chapter of human history. We met the so-called hobbits of Flora's tiny humans who lived on a remote island, who may have shared that island with our own ancestors, possibly even leaving behind echoes in local folklore that lasted for tens of thousands of years before science ever confirmed they were real. We travelled to the Philippines, to Homo luzonensis, a species known from just 13 bones, a patchwork of features old and new, existing at the exact same time as Neanderthals, Denisovans, the Flora's hobbits and us. 5 different kinds of humans alive together on one planet at the same moment. We sat with the strange quiet mystery of the southern Denisovans, a genetic signature so strong in places like Papua New Guinea that it changes how scientists understand entire populations, and yet after all these years with not a single bone to show for it. We visited a small village on Flores where modern pygmies, despite living right next to the cave where the ancient hobbits were found, turned out to share no ancestry with them at all, a quiet reminder that sometimes history rhymes without repeating. We looked at a major genetic study that searched carefully and seriously for signs of interbreeding with Homo erectus, the Flora's hobbits, or Homo luzonensis, and found nothing. A negative result that, instead of closing a door, quietly opened several new ones. We climbed to the Tibetan plateau where a single gene inherited from Denisovans lets people breathe a little easier in air that would leave most of us gasping. And we crossed into the Arctic where another Denisovan gene helps Inuit bodies stay warm through winters most of us will never have to face. And finally we looked at a giant computer-built family tree, one that, in trying to map out where our ancestors actually were across hundreds of thousands of years, kept landing on the same handful of places again and again with the same unanswered question hovering over each one. Who else was there? If you've made it this far with me tonight, I just want to say genuinely thank you. Stories like this one take a lot of care to put together because they sit right at the edge of what we actually know, and I think that edge is one of the most beautiful places a story can live. It's not about giving you neat, tidy answers. It's about showing you just how much wonder is still hiding in plain sight sometimes inside your own body. So as you drift off tonight, I hope you carry just a little bit of that wonder with you. The next time you think about where you come from, maybe it won't just be a name on a family tree or a country on a map. Maybe it'll be something a little stranger and a little more beautiful than that. A whisper of Siberian winters, a trace of island air, a gene that once belonged to someone whose face we will never see quietly living on inside you. Sleep well tonight, and when you're ready, I'll be here with another story, another quiet corner of history waiting to be explored together,